and then you can just... So just put those behind, you know, the next notes, because it's just like the next test material. I did give you an ID sheet because it's basically in front of you. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a profile on Lee Harvey Oswald so you get to know Lee Harvey Oswald a little bit better and maybe understand some of the ways he was. So just kind of follow with me. On July 20th, 1933, Marguerite Oswald married Robert Oswald Sr., which was her second marriage. And Robert Oswald Sr. died on August 19th, 1939, almost 2 months to the day prior to Lee Harvey Oswald's birth, which was October 18th, 1939, and he was born in New Orleans, Louisiana. Well, in January of 1944, Oswald and his mother moved to Dallas, Texas, and in May of 1945, Marguerite married Edwin A. Ethel. And in the fall of 1945, they moved the family to Benbrook, Texas, which was a suburb of Fort Worth, and that's where Lee Harvey Oswald started school. Well, in January of 1947, the family moves again into Fort Worth, and that summer, Marguerite discovers that her husband is having an affair. She confronts him with that. She orders her husband out of her life, and she moves to another apartment in Fort Worth. The point you get here is that Lee did not have the most normal upbringing, and neither did his brother Robert. So after her divorce was finalized, Marguerite bought a 2-bedroom home, and Lee continued his elementary education. In August of 1952, Marguerite sells her home and moves to New York City to live with Lee's brother, John. Now, Marguerite moves into her own apartment in the Bronx, and Lee is transferred to yet another school. Just think of how much transition this kid has had in his early life here. Okay, that's probably some of the reasons why he had issues. By the time he was 13 years old, he had attended 7 different schools. I mean, that's not good, okay? He begins to skip school on a regular basis, and at one point he missed 47 out of 62 days of school and spent most of his time at home or just roaming around alone at the Bronx Zoo. So he was kind of a loner at an early age. Because of his continued truancy, Lee is remanded to a detention home for delinquent boys for 3 weeks of psychiatric study. And on May 10th, 1953, Oswald obtains a handout about Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. Anybody know who they are, by the way, from your history class? They were people that were convicted of treason, spying, and sentenced and executed in the United States. They were United States citizens that were accused of espionage and were executed. And he begins to have an interest in Marxism, which is a certain idea of government, when he's young in 53. In January of 1954, Marguerite moves again. This time she moves back to New Orleans, where they stay with her sister. And shortly afterwards, they moved into their own apartment, and they move again as Lee enters high school. And in July of 1956, Oswald and his mother move again back to Fort Worth. So he's 16 years old, and this is the 17th time he and his mother have moved during his lifetime. Oh, more than once a year. I mean, more often than once a year. Just incredible. So you can kind of get an idea of the upbringing he had. When you think about your life, probably most of you have been in the same school for your whole life. Maybe a move or two, but not 17 moves in 16 years. 16 moves? Holy moly. Well, don't be assassinating any presidents here, okay? Well, finally, Lee enrolls at Arlington Heights High School. He drops out by the end of the month of enrollment, and in October of 1956, he enlists in the United States Marine Corps on his 17th birthday. And this is where it starts getting a little weird, okay? Now, while he was in the Marines, he was trained with an M1 rifle. He scored 212 on his marksmanship test, which in the Marines earned him the qualification of, quote, sharpshooter. And a sharpshooter was a Marine who could shoot accurately and consistently from 200 yards. How far was the shot on the president? 88. So, I mean, people that said he couldn't have done that don't study their history very well. Well, on May 1st, 1957, Oswald is promoted to private first class, and in August he's assigned to the battleship, the USS Bexar, which was stationed in Japan. In October of 1957, Oswald shoots himself as his revolver discharged into his elbow when he dropped it by accident. Okay? In June of 1958, he's court-martialed for having a personal weapon and for verbally assaulting and pouring a drink on an officer. He spent 48 days confinement at hard labor, was assigned full-time to mess hall duty, was docked in pay, and reduced from private first class back to private. So he's having some issues in the military as well. Now it's kind of interesting because during his time in the Marine Corps, he did teach himself a second language, Russian. And how he did it is he basically bought Russian newspapers and with a Russian dictionary learned the language on his own. He stayed in the Marines for nearly 3 years, and in August of 1959 he received an early discharge to care for his ailing mother. And on September 4th, 1959, he applied for a passport, and 7 days later he was released from active duty from the Marines, receiving an honorable discharge. Okay? Then we talk about his trips to the Soviet Union. And on September 20th of 1959, he left New Orleans on a ship for France. In the next 30 days, Oswald goes to London, then flies to Helsinki, Finland, and enters the Soviet Union via train, arriving in Moscow on October 16, 1959. And in Russia, he visited the U.S. Embassy in Russia and did the following. First of all, he renounced his U.S. citizenship, and secondly, he applied for citizenship in the Soviet Union. When Oswald was discovered in Russia, the Soviet government thought he was a member of the CIA. How many Americans traveled to Russia during the Cold War and renounced their U.S. citizenship and applied for citizenship in the Soviet Union? Right away, they thought that sounded weird, so they thought maybe he was, a member of the CIA. When they did their research and found out that this was not the case, they actually recruited him because of his thought process to be a Soviet spy for them back onto the United States. They considered that. Well, after they did more study about him, they didn't believe he was good enough to qualify and let that go. So on October 21st, 1959, the Soviet rejects his application for citizenship, and Oswald attempts suicide. After they denied him, he went to his hotel room and slit his wrist. So really what had happened is Russian officials had underestimated his flair for the dramatic. Was he really trying to kill himself? Most people say no. He really believed that slitting his wrist would force the Soviet government to let him stay, which actually they did, because I just don't think they wanted a hassle with this guy during the Cold War, an American into the Soviet Union. Did they give him citizenship? No, they just let him stay. On January 4th, 1960, Oswald's allowed to stay in the country. He's given $500 by the Soviet Red Cross. And on January 7th, 1960, he travels from Moscow to nearby Minsk, where he obtained an apartment and a job in a radio and television factory. Actually, they didn't want him in Moscow. That's the capital, so they were generous. They got him to the Red Cross. They gave him $500, said, hey, why don't you go to Minsk, see if you can stay there. He did go there, found himself an apartment and a job in a radio and television factory. Now, obviously, he stood out in Minsk because he was by far there was not a lot of Americans in Russia at this time. So he's the only American in Minsk, so he stood out, and that's something he liked. You've got to remember, this is a guy that really liked attention, okay? Well, in Minsk, he met and fell in love with a Russian woman by the name of Marina Prusakova. She was just 19 years old at the time. Well, in September of 1960, once they found Oswald went to Russia, what did the military do? They gave him a dishonorable discharge from the Marines, rather than the honorable discharge that they gave him originally when they found out what he did. Well, in February of 1961, the American embassy in Moscow received a letter from Oswald stating that he wanted to return to the United States. That was in February of 61. On April 30th of 1961, Oswald and Marina were married and began to start a family with daughter June Lee, who was born on February 15th, 1961. Finally, on May 23rd, 1962, Oswald, his wife, and baby June leave Minsk, travel to Moscow, and on June 1st, Oswald obtained a loan from the American Embassy in the amount of $435.71, and 3 days later set sail for the United States from Rotterdam, Holland. So the American Embassy gave him money to get him out of the country. Now, conspiracy theorists will go crazy that this was all a big setup and blah, 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 and whatever, and we'll talk more about that. Now, we're going to talk about Oswald back into the United States. This is kind of an interesting story. On June 14th, 1962, Oswald and his family arrive at Love Field, ironically, in Dallas. Upon his arrival, Lee Harvey Oswald is a man of no importance. He knows no one. He has no friends. He has no deep connections with anyone except his wife Marina, and he's physically abusing her. So according to his brother Robert, Oswald expected this large group of reporters to meet him at Love Field and ask him all kinds of questions about his travels, you know, to Russia and whatever. He really believed in his mind that he was going to have all these people come and do that. And no one met Oswald there, which made him very angry. Well, Oswald and his family first moved in with his brother Robert in Fort Worth. They stayed about a month. And on June 26, 1962, the FBI interviews Oswald for the first time about his stay in the Soviet Union. In July of 1962, the Oswalds moved from the brother's home in with the mother, Marguerite, in Fort Worth, but they soon moved because he could not get along with his mother. He really did not like his mother. Now this is where it gets kind of interesting, and this is part of our trip this summer. So later in July, Oswald gets a sheet metal job, and he rents a one-bedroom apartment at 2703 Mercedes Street in Fort Worth. And on August 16, 1962, the FBI interviews Oswald a second time. On October 8, 1962, Oswald walks out on his job, takes a bus to Dallas, and gets a job at a graphic arts firm. And he uses the company's photo equipment to forge a new identity in the name of Alec J. Heidel and opens up a post office box for Heidel and himself to receive mail. Does that ring a bell? So that's where he made that ID that they found in his pocket, and he went and got a post office box so that A.J. Heidel and Lee Harvey Oswald could get mail at that box, which he did. What did he get? A rifle. We'll talk more about that in a minute. Now this is where my study comes in. On November 3rd, 1962, Oswald rents an apartment in Dallas for $68 a month at 604 Elsbeth Street, and the next day his wife Marina and the daughter move in. Now that particular building no longer exists. A lady bought that and had it destroyed because she wanted to redo the lot. And so I got in touch with her, and she sent me, when they took it down, a brick from the building and a bathroom tile from the bathroom in which Oswald and his wife stayed in. So he probably stepped on this in his life. But anyway, I wanted a little evidence of that place. So the lady was very kind and sent me a brick from the building and a tile from the bathroom. Okay? Because I just wanted, you know, they're going to tear it down. I wanted a little something from that. Well, anyway, on January 27th, 1963, Oswald ordered a handgun under the name of A.J. Heidel with the address of Post Office Box 2915, Dallas, Texas. The point being is he ordered the handgun also, not just the rifle. And he ordered it while he was living where? 604 Elsbeth Street. Okay? The cost of the pistol, ironically, was $29.95. It cost $10 more than the rifle, and he ordered it from Seaport Traders in Los Angeles, California. Okay? Now, in March of 1963, fighting between Lee and Marina becomes intolerable to other tenants in the apartment building. Okay? And as a result, the landlord tells them to stop fighting or leave, so they move into an apartment down the street, a block and a half, at 214 West Neely Street. Now, this is kind of interesting. This is new to my notes because when Blake and I went to the Oak Cliff area to try to find these places this summer, we go to the Elsbeth residence. Okay, and I have no idea where the West Neely place is. So we go to this Elsbeth Street address, and it's just a vacant lot, which I'll show you a picture of. And then all of a sudden we drive down the street, and I look at the street sign, and it says Elsbeth West Neely. And I just looked to my right, and there was the apartment that he lived in where he took the photograph. It was just, I didn't know, it was just like a block and a half away. I didn't even know that until I got there. So that was kind of interesting. So they moved just a block and a half around the corner to 214 West Neely Street, and shortly after the move, he orders the rifle via mail under the name of A.J. Heidel with the same address. So he ordered the pistol from the Elsbeth address and the rifle from the West Neely address. And you know the cost of the rifle was $19.95, including the scope, and was ordered from Klein Sporting Goods through the magazine entitled The American Rifleman. Well, Oswald kept the pistol and the rifle in a small storeroom at the Neely Street apartment, where he spent long periods of time in that storeroom with the weapons. Now, Marina was told by her husband that she was not allowed to enter the storeroom, and it was at the West Neely apartment where Oswald posed for two pictures taken by Marina that we know as the famous backyard photos that kind of cooked his goose. Okay? Now, here is the key to the Kennedy assassination conspiracy. If you don't know anything about Oswald's first assassination attempt, you don't know the story. And like I said, Ruth Payne, who we'll get a chance to talk to, will not even talk to students unless they know this story. This is a key story to the Kennedy assassination. On the weekend of March 9th and 10th, 1963, March, April, May, June, July, August, September, October, November, okay? 8 months prior to the assassination of the president, Oswald photographed the alley behind a home at 4011 Turtle Creek Boulevard in Dallas. The home belonged to Major General Edwin Walker. When did we talk about Walker before? At the beginning, when they told him not to go to Dallas because of these right-wingers. Who was one of the biggest right-wingers? The John Birch Society. And who was one of their biggest supporters? Edwin Walker, a right-winger. He was a highly controversial figure during the early 1960s. He was now living a civilian life in Dallas. He was a right-wing extremist, an anti-communist, and a segregationist with a large following in the South. He was about as right-wing as you could get. Remember, Oswald was pro-communist, was he not? He went to Russia. This guy is absolutely anti-communist, okay? Anti-communist. Well, Oswald outlined a plan to assassinate General Walker. And in his mind, he needed to shoot someone important. So that weekend in March, Oswald photographed a stack of brush that lay just to the east of the Walker home. And this photograph was a visual clue to find the hiding place he planned to leave his rifle for the assassination. You follow me? He photographed a bush in the alley between where he lived and the Walker residence. Well, on Sunday, April 7th, 1963, Oswald left his apartment with the gun underneath his raincoat. He then placed the weapon under the brush, and it remained there for 3 nights until he returned on Wednesday, April 10th, 1963. And on Wednesday, April 10th, 1963, he left Marina a note in Russian telling her his plan and what to do if he was apprehended. So she knew that he was doing something he shouldn't be doing. So he proceeded to General Walker's home. He arrived there approximately 9 p.m. on Wednesday, April 10th. He crouched in the shadows of the alley behind what was called a low lattice fence. You ever seen lattice that people put on their decks? Okay, it was a low lattice fence. Inside the house, the window shades were raised and the interior lights were on as Walker was sitting approximately 100 feet, which would be about 33 yards, from his assassin. Walker sat in plain view, motionless at his desk, with his shirt collar open and his long sleeves rolled up past his elbow. He was concentrating on his income tax return that was due in 5 days. Oswald then rose from his crouch and steadied the gun on the lattice fence, because these lattice fences have V's in them, and he just rested the gun over in the V of the fence, sighting the general's head, believing this would be the easiest shot he could ever make. General Walker's face filled the scope through Oswald's right eye as he squeezed the trigger and fired. Without waiting to see if the bullet had found its mark, Oswald scurried off to hide the weapon. Well, here's what happened. Here's a window in the house. Okay, here's Walker's head, so to speak, in the window. Oswald fires, and the bullet hits the wooden frame of the window. It deflects its path, it misses Walker's head narrowly, and Walker was injured in the forearm by fragments of the bullet, but survived the assassination attempt. General Walker was later quoted as saying, "It was right at 9 o'clock, I heard a blast and a crack right over my head." Uncertain of what had occurred, Walker walked out in front of his desk, turned back toward where he had been sitting, and saw a fresh bullet hole in the wall above his chair. Now, it would not be until police arrived that Walker would brush away the plaster that had fallen into his hair when the bullet hit the wall. Now, this assassination attempt of Walker was well documented by police, but they did not find out that it was Oswald who made the attempt on Walker until when? After the president's assassination. And there's going to be reasons why they figured that out. Okay? So Oswald, 2 hours later, he's pale and sweaty. He walks into his Neely Street apartment without his rifle, because what did he do with it? Hid it back in the bushes after he made the attempt on Walker. He collapsed on the bed and told his frightened wife, "I shot Walker." Marina asked her husband if Walker was dead, and he stated he did not know. After a few